Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcasts. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Adam Francisco, Bruce Hillman, and my father, Scott Keith. Today we are talking about a Lutheran identity crisis. I think Lutheranism is in perpetual identity crisis. It seems at least relatively true, but Lutherans are always fighting over some of the adjectives that should go in front of the word Lutheran. And this is, coming back up again. Some of the common ones are things like confessional Lutheran, which I would probably call myself, and we can dive into that later. Lately, you're hearing a resurgence of the phrase missional Lutheranism. I'm hearing more and more Lutherans also give themselves the title evangelical Catholic, which was
that was a thing in the NALC in the 2010s,
which was a movement, I think, even older than that, and now and now this has seemingly nothing to do with the movement, but just a desire to take back the word Catholic. And then I think Lutherans obviously have the claim to the word evangelical, which in America and the West, we've basically completely given up. So my question is, what do these phrases mean? Which ones should Lutherans sort of cling to or announce, or what's important about these? And do we have a Lutheran identity crisis? We're going to ask the first question to Adam this morning, and we're just going to go around kind of like we have been. I'm going to give you that first one. Does Lutheranism have an identity crisis? Do these terms matter? Do we need to land on a few? Yes, no. What do you think?
Yes, but it's, most things are, a little more complicated because, there's different corners of the Lutheran world. So we're, most of us here, minus Bruce, who's our outlier, marginalized, I don't know what other adjectives we can give to him, but if you're in the LCMS world, that's, it's been going on. Scott, you and I can remember back in the days at Concordia Irvine in the 90s, where I don't know if the nomenclature, people were using the term confessional. Mm-hmm. I think missional was maybe starting to be used, but what really sort of separated groups in terms of identity was what type of worship you prefer or are open to. Remember the old worship wars?
I do.
Versus liturgical or traditional. But now there's also, Caleb, you already mentioned, there's like those who are, it seems the way people talk, there are confessional Lutherans, and then there are missional Lutherans, and never the twain shall they meet. I've always sort of been of the mind that one can be both. But the more you're around people who are like the leaders, thought leaders, maybe we could call them, in those two worlds, the more you realize there's some irreconcilable differences. And some of them are theological, but I think also a lot of them are, maybe the word is dispositional and kind of generational. So yeah, but maybe we ought to define what these terms mean.
Well, we'll do that in a minute here. I want to give Bruce, I think you have a great point with Bruce being outside of the LCMS. So Bruce...
Well, he's marginalized.
He's marginalized, yes. As a marginalized Lutheran, do you experience the Lutheran identity crisis in a different way? I'm going to make it existential like that.
Experiential.
Yeah, in my tradition, the terms confessional and evangelical and missional are used, though I would say missional is probably the most misunderstood in my circle. I would say it's probably about 50-50. So like half the people hear that term as a code word for progressive and social gospel sort of stuff, and the other half hear it as, or they might hear it as like accommodationism to culture. And the other half hear that term, I would put myself in this camp, while recognizing that there are people who use the word that way, that what the word and that movement tries to mean is actually that Christ is for all cultures and that the church is on a mission to bring the gospel to the nations. But in my world, that's the more hotly contested term than the other two. My particular denomination, which is the Lutheran Brethren, likes to call themselves evangelical Lutherans, but they don't mean by that anything like the ELCA, because they're pretty conservative in the Lutheran Brethren. So they mean like literally go out and evangelize through missions and through proselytization. That's how they kind of hear the term, that they're pro-gospel. And confessional is less so in my tradition, because we are a low church tradition that was reacting against Scandinavian high church systems in Europe. So you don't hear as much of the debate on the confessional side in my circles.
All right, Dad, your opportunity. Is there a Lutheran identity crisis on these terms, or is it sort of just nominal?
I think you had it right when you said that Lutheranism has a history of being in sort of perpetual identity crisis. And I think that and the idea of being confessional goes together, given that every one of the Lutheran confessions is written against some sort of controversy that's going on within the church, in an attempt to address it and kind of fix the identity crisis that is caused by the controversy. Do I think we're in one now? I actually do. I think we're in a kind of particular one that stems from what Adam talked about in the 90s, where it was sort of confessional basically meant theologically confessional, as in adhering to the doctrines as they're explicated in the Lutheran book, in the various confessions in the Lutheran Book of Concord, but it also meant liturgical style of worship. And then on the other side, it was sort of the church growthy kind of stuff that really made its bones within Lutheranism in the 90s. An outcropping of that now, there's been a bit of an evolution where I'd say confessional now kind of means a little, at least my perception of it, I'd be open to being corrected on it, a little less theologically confessional and a little more theologically, God, how do I say this without being too offensive? Catholic?
I would maybe, I'm going to probably disagree with you a little bit, right? But we have different exposure. So, but I'll let you finish and then I'll go ahead.
Well, so if there was I guess what I'm saying, in the 90s, if it was sort of confessionally theological as the material principle, this sort of worked itself out formally through being liturgical also, I feel like that's flipped.
Okay.
That sort of materially now you're liturgical, and there's, a hope that means you're confessional. But in my sort of listening to the theology of some of these guys, it doesn't always seem very confessional to me. Again, this is the problem with a question like this is, how do you prove it? Like,
you can't.
I don't know.
Yeah, you can't.
This is my opinion my opinion is very much based on the exposure that I have to certain individuals. So,
yeah,
I mean, one of the things
you get in the broader Lutheran world too, that it gets even more complicated when an institution, maybe a college, would describe its aspirations being to be a confessionally Lutheran college or university. You're like, what does that mean outside of theology? Is there confessional Lutheran mathematics? I mean,
yeah,
it gets it, it's so defining terms and getting to the, I know Bruce is going to object to my use of the word essence, but getting to the essence of it is really important here.
Well, I guess another way to say what I was trying to say is that I really felt like the essence of the confessional movement in the 90s was theological, and I feel like it's more cultural now. And there's a way to express that cultural essence is through through liturgical practices that in my lifetime have, with that group of people, gone higher and higher and higher.
Sure.
To a point where I've been an LCMS Lutheran for going on 53 years and have, until recently never seen, and only belonged to very liturgical churches my entire life, and never seen some of the things that are practiced now. Yeah. Until I walk into a church and they're doing it, I'm like, oh, and then you ask me well, we've been doing this for 500 years. And I'm saying, well, geez, where was I for the last 53 of the 500 that we were doing this?
That's my experience too with this new kind of, you described it as confessional, but it's not necessarily a theological thing. It more describes a practice and a culture. So like I said earlier, like a disposition or a posture.
Yeah, I like that.
Can I give the the young people perspective.
Sure, young person.
Since I haven't been around, I was like,
Do you get to call yourself a young person after your birthday when you turn 30?
when I turned 30 this year, probably not. That's probably old person
That's
territory. I can't. As somebody who was a wee infant in the height of the worship wars, and then I think was spared from it by just going to a pretty normal, like, liturgical church that wasn't seemingly reacting either direction growing up. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that would be sort of the way I viewed it. And also just knowing other pastors who will be old men in the next couple of years, I guess, turning 30 as well. And then also just younger people online. I feel like the confessional umbrella and what you guys are experiencing is that title is really massive now, because it used to be a narrow group sort of positioning themselves against a different movement. I think now it's a catch-all that has utility for identifying that you're not ELCA. So when Lutherans are online, you have to ascribe yourself something when you're engaging with other Christians, and everybody knows about those liberal Lutherans. And so you have to say, how am I going to say I don't have homosexual clergy in a concise way and without saying it every time? And one of the ways you do that is by saying confessional, because it immediately sort of includes conservative, adheres to the confessions, probably Missouri Synod, given what Bruce just said, that most of the micro synods don't have those terms, but even within them, NALC, LCMC, there would be groups who identify as confessional in order to distance themselves from certain positions. So I think it has...
Within the ELCA, there are groups that
call themselves confessional to distance themselves
from ELCA.
Correct. So I think it has utility in doing that. And then there are, within the confessional umbrella now of people, because if you had to ask me to identify myself to a non-Lutheran, I would say I am a confessional Lutheran. And that is, for me, a theological statement. I adhere to the Lutheran confessions, and I think that's a standard that my church needs to adhere to in its practice and doctrine. So, but the umbrella is now big and includes movements like, this higher church or liturgy focused almost exclusively, like you said, liturgy then theology movement. I'm sure nobody in that camp would sort of say that's the way the bus is driven, but it certainly can look that way. And then there's some various other things in there too, sort of just some middle Missouri people who don't want to get caught up in stuff.
I have an interesting anecdote an anecdote that you brought up. You said you were spared it because you grew up in a pretty normal liturgical church in Carson City, Nevada. It was Bethlehem Lutheran Church. The pastor when you got there was Pastor Dieterding. And my anecdote is this. He was not, in my opinion, a big participant in the worship wars at the time. But when we first got to that church, when we moved to Nevada in 2001. Yeah.
It had been split by the worship wars, right?
Kind of. Yeah, it had been split by the worship wars, kind of. But my bigger interaction with it was when we got there, Pastor Dieterding was teaching the congregation to chant part of the services. Now, that had been a very liturgical church since its inception for, I think probably 70 years, and had never chanted, right? So this is sort of one of my, and I had been part of First Lutheran Church Palmdale growing up, very liturgical church, never chanted. Went to school at Grace Lutheran Church Lancaster, very liturgical church, never chanted. When these sort of worship wars came up and confessional and liturgical came together, very early on, you started seeing sort of like additions to the liturgy to make it more apparent that it was the liturgy. And one of those was the chanting of the parts of service. Now, some 30-ish years or 25-ish years later, chanting parts of service is totally normal to me.
I miss it. But that's probably because I grew up with it.
To a degree, I do too, because the last place we interacted with it was Faith Capo Beach, and man, the chanting was beautiful there. So it's just an interesting anecdote that these things, that it was in a sense, and it wasn't, but that before in my lifetime at least, this sort of confessional versus contemporary worship kind of thing, this sort of quote unquote worship wars changed both directions.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Sure.
I wonder if there's another thing in historical Lutheranism that has made the question of identity more difficult than maybe in some other traditions, in the sense that, Lutheranism really came about as being a movement of reform, right? So it was a pro-Catholic movement from its own side of things, right? It was trying to reform the Catholic Church. So it didn't start off as a movement that was trying to identify itself as more truly what it thought it was. And then when the break with Rome came, we became known as Lutherans, and that was sort of the way to distinguish us was by the person. And of course, we have developed the confessions and everything, but I just wonder if the fact that Lutheranism had its start always as being defined through and by the other, if that has made it somewhat difficult sometimes for us to capture, as Adam says, the essence of who we are. And the confessions are, I would wager they're the closest thing, but to maybe finding that. But the problem with that is that the confessions are our theology, so that's central and important, but you also have tradition and culture that enter in to make an identity as well, like chanting and some of these other things you've mentioned. They become part of traditions within churches, and that becomes part of identity. So I don't know. I just wonder if Lutherans from the start have always struggled a little bit with this question, if it goes deeper than just what's happening now.
Do you think it part
We're pretty insufferable.
Well, do you think that part of it is the birth out of the university and the sort of consequent debate that came out of that? I mean, this is the Reformation movement that was born out of a university by university professors, and debate is at its core. At very earliest parts of Lutheran theology are debate, literal debates, and being called to colloquies to have answers, and then to have those answers challenged and to answer back. And I think we're just used to mixing it up, and I think when you're accustomed, when you have a 500-year history of sort of a willingness to scrap over, intellectually scrap over issues, you're not going to shake that. And this is from our birth.
Yeah, I think there's a minimum. So, the word evangelical was it has been always important to the Lutheran Church, right? That was what we were. We were the evangelicals. We were the gospelers, and reforming the church to bring the proclamation of the gospel back to the forefront. And I think at the beginning of all of our confessions, that's how it's listed, right? This is the evangelical Lutheran Church. And in fact, even our church bodies, it doesn't sound like Lutheran Brethren, but like the Missouri Synod's actual name is the Evangelical Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
Of the Missouri Synod.
It's like we drop the E in the acronym all the time, but that's how it's drafted. And, even with the ELCA, that first word is evangelical. Now that makes it scary, or American evangelicalism, that which sort of just means non-denominational, or is its own weird denomination of some Reformed theology, some Baptist theology, and then whatever that pastor's interested in. But that word seems extremely important. But I also think you have to minimally, confess the confessions, at least the Augsburg Confession, to call yourself a Lutheran, and better yet, the Book of Concord. And so I do think there are some purposes to these borders, like confessional. I know it can mean certain things within the worship board, but if somebody is not willing to say that they confess the Lutheran confessions, I would not say you can call yourself a Lutheran. Those are the documents, the borders of Lutheranism. So,
Caleb, do you think we should define what we mean by confess, the confessions, or confessional?
Sure.
Because
I was going to let you, Adam, define confessional and missional. How about you? Just go for
it. Somebody needs to define missional, because I believe I don't know what it means.
I'll slander it.
Do missional, and you can do confessional. How about that?
That's fair.
Okay.
So who's going first, Adam? Yeah,
I'll do. Yeah. So I think missional, and I know Bruce can probably add to this too, but it depends kind of like where in the sort of development of missional, you're looking. But I think best construction, the so-called, or what maybe people like Caleb and younger would call the thought leaders of the missional world, best construction is they would say for example, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in the United States does not understand or needs to understand that we do not live in Christendom. We do not live in the world that the first people who made up the Missouri Synod, C.F.W. Walther and others, lived in, and we live in a mission field. So therefore, our posture and our confession, our public declaration, our assertions in that environment need to be more contextualized. And so, like, here's the story I've heard actually just over the weekend from somebody who could be considered a thought leader in that missional world. Is 40 years ago, guys who are Lutherans and missionaries who are out in the mission field, maybe they're in like Congo or Papua New Guinea, wherever.
Places that are now sending America missionaries.
Yeah, well, if they're out there, they're doing their thing. They're like living among tribes. They're participating in what would look to us from the outside like a religious feast, and maybe they were kind of religious feasts of a sort. They're taking part in ceremonies, and as they're trying to become closer to insiders in that particular culture, so that they have some sort of authority is not the right word, but they have some clout. People will start trusting them and so on, right? And so a lot of leeway, I'm using air quotes here, was given to those Lutherans, confessional Lutherans in those mission contexts, because they had to do it. Otherwise, they're not going to be heard. There won't be any way to articulate the gospel in a way that's persuasive or winsome or whatnot. But now, if you put them in a different context and they take that same approach, let's say to America 40 years ago, they get off like the mission field in Sentinel Island. Look that up on YouTube. It's like the last reached people. If you go there, you'll get killed and probably eaten.
Yeah. That's a place where you go to die.
But let's say you were on Sentinel Island. You come back. You're in your 60s. You're retired from the mission field, but you still have that same sort of posture in American culture where there are churches and there's all these vestiges from a day and age where the church was a major player in American culture and society. But your posture is the way you tailor your proclamation is similar to the way you did it to the people of Sentinel Island or wherever it was. And I think the best construction, the best argument from the missional crowd, whoever the missional crowd is, that America is not what it once was. It is, and we're way past the age of Christendom and a church culture and so on. And so therefore, all the hair splitting, these are not my words, of the confessions and Lutheran dogmatics doesn't really matter anymore in terms of the public profession, to the outside world as they're looking at the church. Doesn't matter as much anymore as, say, you're speaking the gospel very clearly and like a kind of mere Christianity sort of approach. So what is missional? It's driven by at the best form of it, I would say, is driven by a theology that says at the heart and soul of the scriptures are, of course, Jesus Christ. But, and maybe but's not the right word, and is a better word, and Jesus Christ was one who was sent to seek and to save the lost. And the church is here to participate in that mission, not as like a lawful prescription, but rather is privileged to participate in what's called the Missio Dei, the mission of God. That's why the church and why Christians are here first and foremost. It's not to gather in social clubs called churches, but rather to participate in God's mission to seek and to save the lost. That's the way I've heard it articulated by people who
there's some parts of that you can kind of go amen to, and some parts of it that you say,
absolutely. Yeah.
Wow,
it's not wrong.
Seems like a misunderstanding of church.
Yeah, there's some weird presuppositions about church there.
No, sorry, if you don't mind, can I just add, so the missio is Latin for sending. So that's kind of the idea. So the theology is grounded in the idea, it's grounded in the Trinity. If you read the literature, it's actually, so as the Father sends the Son and the Son sends the church is sent out. And missional theology, as I understand it, and some people who would be in this camp would be like Leslie Newbegin, would be an early person of that who's in the Lutheran camp. But then maybe more famous in the field will be a guy named Laman Sana, who I think he's retired now, but he did a lot for missional theology as far as kind of parsing out academically what it's supposed to maybe look like. But as I understand it, it's like Adam said, it's grounded. It has an apologetic side to it. It's all about contextualization. It's about the local church. I think this is what's important, not this gigantic institutional church, but the local church being called and being sent out to be bearers of the gospel. And that as those bearers, they are to be wise and contextual with the gospel message. So they're not supposed to accommodate themselves to culture if it's done well. They're supposed to let the gospel change culture. But they let the gospel change culture by, like what Adam said, being winsome and meeting actual needs. And actually, my understanding of it is it is the proclamation of the gospel, but it comes with an understanding, if I can put it in a kind of pejorative or colloquial way, that people won't care what you say till they know that you care. So there's a sense where you also have to meet the felt needs of people too.
Yeah, and this is like the best case, or the
yes.
Here's the thing though, in the so-called missional movement, whatever that is there's a lot of so the way I've seen it, trying not to name names or organizations, but where whatever the felt needs of the culture are, ideological or otherwise, they're on board with that. So there's one organization I'm thinking about in particular that is all about social justice issues, and they would claim it's part of their sort of not missional strategy, but it's part of what the church does as part of it being being a part of God's mission here on earth. But what they do is basically absorb the ideology of those movements, and effectively, I mean, the colloquialism would be they start carrying water for these pretty extreme progressivist movements. And I don't know if it's they don't recognize that, or in a way their disposition is, like these more secular progressive when it comes to those sorts of matters. I think it's probably the latter, because you see some folks who would describe themselves as missional, who are now, what are we, like 2 months after the inauguration, who have kind of they got a little bit of TDS, but it's hard to know whether they're speaking as a Christian or they're speaking on behalf of AOC or some other pretty extreme Democratic type of leader. So I think one of the reasons why those who maybe would call themselves confessional have issues or look a little cross-eyed at the missional movement is because there are some representatives of the missional movement, and it might even be a majority of them, I don't know, but who are kooky, to use a technical term,
Yeah, it seems like I've always had a hard time understanding the difference between being outwardly evangelical and missional. Like, for instance, I would say 1517 is evangelical. I would not necessarily, in the way you're describing, I would not say it's missional in the way you described it. In other words, it's focused on the proclamation of the gospel. You could, in a sense, with 1517 say to the world, because it's most of what we do is online, and it goes out to, many thousands of people, many of whom we don't know. So, but it's evangelical. It's gospel forward. Now, it doesn't change the gospel. I hope that it doesn't change the gospel. In fact, we had a show on this to be sort of,
just a couple episodes ago,
more relevant or more appealing, because it's the most relevant thing on the planet, in that it addresses the problem that everybody has. When you're describing it, I'm not trying to be rude to your description, but I felt like I wandered into a breakout at a conference that I immediately was looking for the door. Like, where is it? Get me out of this breakout.
Well, so yeah, that's
somebody lied about this title.
Yeah, the first bit where you said there's a lot of good in there. My sympathy, I don't know, theological sympathies are, I think there's something to the scriptures being about a description of God's mission, and that the church is participant in that. It doesn't stop with Jesus and the apostles. There is this old Lutheran sort of tradition. You find it expressed pretty clearly in Johann Gerhard, one of the great systematicians of the Lutheran theological tradition, who in the polemical context argued that when Rome was accusing or saying that Lutherans can't consider themselves to be apostolic in any way because they're not actually sending people out to do missions, and Gerhard responded and said, well, the Great Commission ended with the age of the apostles because the gospel went out to all four corners of the earth. And that, I think there might be something that those who would how do I put this how do I put this fairly? That's sort of buried in some confessional theology, that sort of thing. And I have real problems with that what God's mission on earth ends with the apostles, really. Now it's just all about maintaining. I've just...
No, but there's also a problem with saying that the purpose of the church is just missional outside the church.
Right. Oh, sure.
And not to proclaim the gospel and administer the gifts of the sacraments to the people that God has called the pastor there to serve directly. I mean, I think this is where this all goes kind of haywire for me, is when they start talking about, well, your church exists for the sake of the world. And I'm like, no. Actually, when you look at Scripture, when churches were formed, in particular places, it was to serve the people that had become Christian in those places, not necessarily to go and, out into that world. It was to serve those people that were now Christian. And there was a role, I mean, we eventually called it missionary, right?
Yeah.
Of people to go out and to sort of make new Christians, or evangelists to go out and to make new Christians. But that was not the same role that a pastor in a congregation served. And 9 times out of 10, when I've seen pastors in congregations that think more of their job is outside the walls of the church, I'm trying to.
Can I add?
It's usually meant that they weren't great pastors in the church because they were so focused of charity work outside the church, or picking up the leftover bread, or whatever it was at the end at the day, or orphanages, or all of which are amazing services, right? That Koenig, in his book Creative Minority, says is one of the ways Lutherans in America sort of really established themselves as a sort of cultural force in their regions, by orphanages, old folks' homes,
schools,
soup kitchens, schools, that type of thing. All of which but that's different than what the pastor's job in the church is.
100%.
Especially in Lutheranism.
Well, yeah, the definition of the church is where the gospel is preached and the sacraments administered. It's a very narrow definition.
Yeah, I agreed. 100%. Here's the thing, though, is then in like some of the confessional circles, at least this ethos emerges. Sometimes it's overtly taught that if there is any chance of evangelization, or if there's any sort of component to the church's life in the world that could be described as missional or missionary, it's simply for the laity are not really to be doing that sort of work, but rather inviting people to church to hear the gospel and to participate in the sacraments. And I mean, that's fine, but I mean, so you let's say you invite somebody to church, they hear the gospel, and then they're told, hey, we're having the Lord's Supper. And I got no issues with this, but just for the record, right? But then you're like, but you can't do this.
Yeah, we've run into that quite a bit.
Cutting off of any kind of evangelical or missionary involvement of the laity, to be frank. We can get into some serious weeds over like the preaching office and the pastoral office. Some people collapse. I mean, I think that's the real theological thing, is they collapse the two, that only the pastor, because his vocation is to preach the gospel and administer the sacraments, he's the only one who does that. Otherwise, you're stepping outside your role. You're not rightly called to be a missionary because you're, whatever. That's, and I'm just, by the way, Scott, I'm describing.
Oh, I know.
I
I
don't
know.
really have a dog in this fight.
I've talked to Enoch about this. Can I say? And
Bruce wants to chime in.
In the missional stuff I've read, I think it would agree with Scott. At least from the academic standpoint, pretty much everything I've read would say that the local church's job or the pastor's job is to. It's not completely exclusive. It's not like the pastor shouldn't be a living example of what a missionary should be in the community, but his primary role is to train and to equip the saints to go out. And so in the missional theology, as I understand it, the local church, it's very local, right? So the local church is the sending church out into their local community. And the pastor's job in proclaiming the gospel is also to encourage and equip those people to then go out and preach the gospel in their local communities. And that, now the local church itself as an organization should also be for its community. And I mean, you see this in the New Testament too. They took care of widows. They're well known by their opponents, the Romans themselves, for taking care of the poor when no one else does. I mean, Cyprian writes quite a bit about this from different Romans who couldn't believe that the church was taking care of even Jewish poor people when the state had no interest in doing so. So it's not that the church is completely insular to the culture, but the missional idea, as I understand it, is that the church is the place where Christians go, they hear the gospel preached, they receive the sacraments, and then having been given that word and grace, they're sent out to do the Lord's work among their community. And I think missional theology at its best is trying to stress that work of the church, because in Christendom and post-Christendom, what's happened is the church ends up being circular and living for itself. So it justifies doing a lot of things for itself in the name of doing it. It's just doing it for itself. And so what happens is that the gospel does not actually get preached, and the poor do not actually hear good news, and needs of the community aren't met, and the church is not a real witness in the community. It becomes more and more insular, and then it defends its insularity as a kind of virtue. And that's what I think missional theology is against.
So I have some, I don't know, I got a lot of thoughts after this. We're not going anywhere fast, so but that's fine. But
These are going to be a
do you
doozy.
even get to describe confessional?
no, we didn't yet.
I know.
Maybe this is a two-parter or something. But the big thing I have is the presupposition, and Adam, the description you gave, I've heard so many times, so I'm going to roll with that this is common, which is calling churches the gathering place of the saints, the place where God administers his gifts. Country clubs or old boys clubs or club. And this also comes with the accusation that when Christians do go out and proclaim the gospel to their closest neighbor, i.e. their family, their kids, that's just part of being in the club. So I've heard missional people within the synod sort of critique the idea that one of the ways that the church thrives in the world, grows, expands, and preaches the gospel to the world is to baptize children and to have children that it be baptizing.
As your dad knows, my theology could probably be described as "you do you, boo." To be real, like transparent and vulnerable. Not really, but all this talk in our circles over missional, and it's just
all the talk.
I don't know what word.
Full stop. All
bloody
the
talk. Just like just a bunch of nagging people. Wanting to tell other people what they should think and how they should live, etc. How about you it's like the old, was it Cicero who says, stop talking about being a virtuous man, just be one. I mean, if you want to be missional, okay, do it. And do it among your family. Well, the easiest ones to reach. And then like concentric circles.
Missionally have children, baptize them, and raise them in the faith.
I'm also sorry, and I'm not trying to be rude here, but the Missouri Synod, I am. The Missouri Synod, in polling data, does extraordinarily badly in the last 2 generations with its children staying Lutheran. Now, staying Christian, fine, but staying
probably doing badly with that.
but not as bad. But staying Lutheran, really not great. If you can't even pass down the faith to your own kids, what business do you have being the example church to go pass it on to the world? I mean, that's
Mic drop. That's what that was.
that. So I want to be missional in the sense of being truly evangelical as a church. The gospel for all people at all times, in all places, and that when that opportunity arises, and even the church should set apart certain individuals to go into further places or into communities, etc.
I mean, like evangelists?
Yeah, like evangelists, that we do that.
It might
That
be
we
interesting to see why they're leaving Lutheranism and joining the ones who are leaving and then joining other Christian groups. And I would guess, I've not seen this data at all, so this is just a guess. My guess would be if it would have something to do with the fact that the other traditions are out promoting, for lack of a better word, I guess, some type of care in the community that the young people find attractive that they don't find in Lutheranism. That sometimes in its worst case would be very insular in its worst case. So if you have a denomination, and I'm not saying this is Missouri Synod, I'm just making a general point. If you have a denomination that's perceived as being all about its internal self-sustaining, maintaining its traditions, and not going out and caring for others, I don't think that that's a good recipe for a lasting church.
Can I? Okay. I'm never going to get to my.
Can you define Christian? And Scott,
And it was bomb, all right? So, or fire. What is it? It was fire, all right? Okay. No, but why is there not a distinction between works of charity in the world and
missions.
and the mission of the gospel? Because there is a distinction, right? I cannot tell you how many times I've encountered church groups that go do, acts of charity in the world as a part of the church, but never share the gospel.
Yeah.
And then that's called evangelism or mission work of some kind. And I'm like, okay, it is, I guess, but it's actually not Christian mission work unless the gospel of Jesus Christ comes on your lips with that. If it's just feeding the poor, if it's just building houses in poor regions of the world, if it's just digging wells, if it's just clothing, these are all valuable things to do, and valuable things that the church has always participated in, as works of charity. I actually think that example of Acts of taking care of widows was taking care of Christian widows, but whatever. But taking care of people has always been part of what the church does, but it's not the mission of the church proper.
Yeah,
the
or the poor you always have with you.
The mission of the church proper is to preach the gospel of Christ Jesus. Now, if sort of opening a soup kitchen means that there are more people sitting in our little empty area out here every day to whom we can preach the gospel, okay, and it could even still be valuable if we're just giving them soup. But I'm not going to call it like a proper sort of mission of the church if it's just soup, because Christ isn't attached.
Well, I would say it's not evangelistic, but I would say it could be missional. I mean, it's teaching everything I have commanded you, which isn't just the gospel. That includes the law, and that includes Jesus's commandments to love and care for others, including the poor. So I think in a broader sense, one could say that the mission of the church, if you're doing it for those reasons and you intend to bring the gospel and then do bring the gospel at some point, if that's part of your missional strategy, like a missionary who goes over to Papua New Guinea or wherever, and they go, well, they need a school, and if you want to get a hearing, you got to build a school. I wouldn't be comfortable saying that's not part of the mission. But if you never got to the gospel at a certain point, I think you could say, yeah, you're just doing social justice. I would make a distinction between being evangelical and missional, like you said before. I think that's very helpful.
You can have Christian charity, right? That is just Christian charity, right? In other words, charity done by Christians, charity done by local congregations. That is just Christian charity. That is actually not missional as Lutherans understand the mission of the church, right? As defined in the Augsburg Confession, is that place where the gospel is preached and the sacraments are rightly administered. Now, you could also, I think, have Christian charity that was attached to some evangelism that would then make it missional. My issue is that when you sort of call something a mission of the church and it's only charity. Now, charity is something Christian congregations do that they do out of love, right? But it's not why they exist as a congregation.
Sure,
and that's
other
my
religions
point.
are way better at it than we are. If it's just talking,
Or even other denominations.
Catholics are very good at this.
Yeah. I mean, they literally have something called Catholic charity.
Bill and Belinda Gates Foundation.
Sure. Oh, well, that's straight evil. That is straight evil, my friend.
I'm just letting they spend a lot of money on stuff.
I'm promoting their charitable evil.
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
I'm agreeing with you on the point.
You also have to, in order to be missional, I think you have to not be in identity crisis in some ways as well, because you are going to have to. So to say, like, let's stop splitting hairs over the confessions and the scripture and what this church is in its doctrine, and let's start being missional. I don't know how you can send people without knowing what you're supposed to teach, right? And so this is part of, you have to have an identity as a theology, like a theological identity and truth, the confessions of truth in order to go on a mission, in order to send people. You're sending people with the truth of the gospel. And so in order to do that, you can be part of something with an identity already. So
I'm just probably jaded by too many undergrad trips to far-flung parts of the world that were called missional trips that were really just like travel adventure trips for groups. This
like a Bible study at the end.
with a Bible study at the end, you know.
A campfire and a Bible study.
And
Not
on
a
it's like,
mission trip.
come on, give me a break. Or like
There was something like there was a term for this, something tourism that popped up. It was used as a critique of
I did. And the point for me, the take home for me, is just that the advantage I see in the parts of missional theology that I'm attracted to is just that churches can navel gaze too much, and it's a reminder that at some point they actually do have to go out and preach that gospel and care for others. And that is ultimately what Jesus is after. He's not after us all getting every I dotted and every T crossed at the expense of not doing whatever you want to call it, the mission. And that's where I think I appreciate the critique, is churches can spend so much time saying, are we doing this right? Are we doing this right? That they never actually get out there and be and take the risks of the persecution or of failure or whatever it would be to actually proclaim the gospel and care for their neighbors in some way, and have to deal with what that means to even be successful at that. You know, your culture can change if you start bringing in a lot of people, and I think churches have a fear of that as well, especially if they're like a Lutheran church in a community that has changed around them. So in my denomination, and I'm not picking on this church, but just to give an example, they started in a very Norwegian section of New York City, one of our churches. And that section now is all Chinese. And so they started a Chinese-speaking church along with the American Norwegian side. The American Norwegian church now is very small. The Chinese church is quite large. But they had to make that move to understand that their sort of Norwegian American style of church was going to fade away, and they had to start supporting this Chinese church that they started with a Chinese pastor that they brought in, who's Lutheran. So it's the same Lutheran church, same denomination. I just don't know if a lot of churches are willing to do that for the sake of the gospel. They would much rather try to be entrenched and survive as long as they can. So for me, if there's an upswing to missional theology, it's that reminder that churches are on a mission and that it does cost us sometimes the things that we find valuable, but maybe are just a little bit worldly, like our traditions and things that we're tempted to keep.
Yeah, I don't totally disagree with that. I do think we need to probably do a part 2, since we apparently there is an identity crisis because we really couldn't do it all in one episode. So
You should title the next episode, "What is Confessional?" and have the gotten start with.
yeah, that's how we'll do it. We'll just roll. We'll just roll in. I'll say this last sort of closing thing on the missional front is, I do think in all of this, one of the anxieties always, and this is the problem with having a large synod is that we think about this in terms of sort of universal, what could the synod be doing better? And then when we talk about what we don't think it's doing, we have specific churches in mind that bother us, like on this front, either missional or confessional. I do think in order to be missional, it's actually very congregational because you need some people who are exposed to the mission, a place for them to come back to, right? And so when it's detached from local congregations, I have a harder time envisioning this because I think there needs to be a landing place. And that's, that may mean that the specific church is sending out a missionary doing something. And if you want to get traction on something like this, you think something's not right, start at home, right? Start at home or start in your circuit, or start in your district, or start in your wherever so that there's a local presence. And I'll add this as we go into part 2. I do think that it is very interesting that the missional crowd, in the Missouri Synod at least, and certain thought leaders in them are very critical of 1517 often. So as being confessional. And I think it's very odd because we also try to get people into specific congregations when exposed and things like that. And also we're just doing the gospel in a way that's sort of detached from the tradition of the church body. On the other side, confessionals are often very skeptical of us too, because we look missional, because the art maybe looks, new, looks 21st century. The website's functioning and it's not explicitly only for Lutherans. The content isn't only for Lutherans. So the question is, how are you preserving confessional identity? So then so it falls somewhere in between. I tend to believe that means that we're making some success on the balance of these fronts in ways. Right. Then
at least I am. I don't know about you, Kev.
I would say for people who wonder, I don't know, I can't speak totally for everybody, but people who wonder think it's a confessionally Lutheran organization that then is evangelical in its doing of theology, that is proclaiming the gospel to as many people as possible. And so that's kind of the perspective we come in. But in part 2, we now need to identify confessional, because if that definition is going to be true, that we're confessionally Lutheran, or that its main teachers and fellows are all confessionally Lutheran, we have to say, what does that mean, especially when we have a confessional movement that we maybe have some critiques of. So that will be part 2. Come in next week. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe if you've been listening to the Thinking Fellows. You can also now subscribe to the Thinking Fellows on YouTube. Right now, probably as of listening to the show, there's primarily the audio podcast there, which also makes the podcast available on the YouTube Music app and things like that. And then we're rolling out more and more video as time goes on. So do subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already. We thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time. Bye.